Temu was launched in the US, which is the first market in September 2022. That is when Shein just started to gain a lot of traction. There's a lot of attention being paid to Shein. At the beginning, a lot of people think Temu is a copycat of Shein in the way that they both sell goods from China in this direct from China shipping model. However, I think the competition has evolved quite differently now, and Temu has done some business and operational innovation that has made others, including Shein, to have to catch up.
Welcome to Analyse Asia, the premier podcast dedicated to dissecting the pulse of business, technology, and media in Asia. I'm Bernard Leong, and Temu and Shein have been the new darlings of e-commerce from China that have successfully expanded into the shores of the United States. Given the recent tensions between the US and China, what does it mean for them moving forward? What is Amazon's response against these competitors today? With me today, Jing Yang, the Asia Bureau Chief from The Information. Jing, welcome back to the show again. And it was great meeting you in person when I was visiting Hong Kong in June that set up today's conversation.
Thank you for having me back again. Glad to be here.
So since our last conversation, what have you been up to?
If you're referring to since the last time I was on the show, that was in March. And then obviously after the TikTok crisis slowed down a little bit, I started right off writing a lot about Shein and Temu, which we're going to get into in a moment. And if you're referring to since June, so I just come back from 2-week vacation. In case I'm a little bit incoherent, apologies in advance.
Well, one interesting thing before we want to go forward is, as I was in Hong Kong, I could not access OpenAI's ChatGPT. I have to thank you for enlightening me that the Chinese government did not ban ChatGPT. So why is ChatGPT from OpenAI not accessible in Hong Kong?
Let's first break down the questions between mainland China or PRC and Hong Kong, because there are two different jurisdictions still. So OpenAI never made its services or its product available in either jurisdiction. The company hasn't really said a lot publicly about why. What I can tell you, because I don't really know the thinking of Sam Altman, is that so in China, if you want to release a generative AI product or app to consumers, then you need to get approval from the cybersecurity watchdog, the CAC. They need to look at the underlying data you use to train the model, and you need to do some testing to make sure it's all politically correct. So it could be quite cumbersome, to say the least, for any company who wants to do that. Hong Kong doesn't have similar regulatory framework when it comes to generative AI. Obviously, I think it's a choice that the OpenAI made consciously to not make their services available here. My colleagues in Asia here on my bureau did a really interesting story just a few weeks ago. You probably saw some headlines about OpenAI sending letters to developers in Hong Kong and mainland China who have been accessing their APIs through VPN or maybe some other unofficial means, and then they are cracking down on that. What our reporting revealed very quickly is that as Microsoft has a partnership with OpenAI, which they call Azure OpenAI, that means any Azure customers can apply and pay for access to OpenAI's services, including ChatGPT and their models. Customers in both mainland China and Hong Kong continue to have the ability to access OpenAI models and APIs through Azure. This is something that I think people didn't really think about before, which I think is quite interesting, which also shows how Microsoft and OpenAI seemingly taking different approaches when it comes to China market in general. Obviously, I know it doesn't really solve the consumer question you asked me, right? As a consumer, you still cannot use ChatGPT, but at least as a company, you can through Microsoft Azure.
I was advising a couple of companies on generative AI, and one of the firms I've actually advised, they're actually now using the Azure's version of the OpenAI, which is running on ChatGPT 4.0. Not as fantastic as the actual access I'm getting when I'm in Singapore and I have to VPN out on that. Just to close out this, can the people in Hong Kong actually access the Chinese LLMs? Because from my standpoint in Singapore, I couldn't access Baidu's earning board. I actually have to rely on a Chinese student of mine because I'm teaching in a university. They need the Chinese mobile phone number in order to be able to access by those LLM from wherever they are?
For early bot, my understanding is that you need to have a mainland China phone number. Then you can have it from Hong Kong. But don't take my word for it because I haven't actually tried for a while. However, you see some other players in from China, for example, SenseTime, which was a leader in the computer vision age a few years ago, right? They adopted as one of the so-called four AI dragons in China in the computer vision age. So SenseTime has also been developing some LLMs, and a couple of months ago, they released a Cantonese version dedicated to the Hong Kong market, which I think is quite interesting. Yeah. They also
So
have they also recently released a Thai version.
really, wow.
Yeah.
Actually, China's companies, tech companies are very active in Thailand. That by itself is also going to be a story, which I think I should try to get someone to talk about as well. But today I got you here because it's the whole series of stories that you have been covering on Temu and Shein in this era of uncertainty. I thought this would be a great story to have it on the podcast. So maybe to start, let's start with just doing an introduction to both companies which originated in China but have successfully expanded globally, which is Shein and Temu. Shein is now incorporated in Singapore, while the Chinese company Pinduoduo wholly owns Temu and is also listed on Nasdaq. So maybe can you provide some overview of the origins of Shein and Temu and how have they evolved since their inception?
So the two companies' origins are actually quite different. Let's start with the Shein. Shein has four co-founders led by the current CEO, Yang, who goes by the English name Sky Xu. And then there are different accounts on their origin because the original team and the company, I think, started in 2008. However, they did so many like random things for the first few years. So if on some level you can say that their e-commerce history really started in 2012 when they started selling, and they started by selling wedding gowns from China to overseas markets. And at that time, the website domain is called Shein site. Then later they changed to Shein and then becomes the Shein that we know today. The company's management has been very elusive and secretive, as we'll probably talk about later. But this is sort of Shein's origin, right? Their headquarters in China when they started, their headquarters in Nanjing, because that's where the four co-founders started. And then they met each other from I think their previous job. For Temu, as you know, is an offshoot of Pinduoduo, which has been around for quite some time, which has sort of disrupted the Chinese e-commerce landscape substantially. They came almost from nowhere when people believed that the Chinese e-commerce market was already pretty much dominated by both Alibaba and JD, and that is it, right? The battle was over.
Yeah.
So Pinduoduo came along and become a really formidable rival to both companies, and still is the case. So you can see how history has repeated itself when it comes to the US at a time when we think Amazon is the only game in town when it comes to e-commerce in the US. And then so Temu they launched in the US, which is their first market in September 2022. And that is when Shein just started to, gain a lot of traction. And then there's a lot of attention being paid to Shein. At the beginning, a lot of people think Temu is a copycat of Shein in the way that they both sell goods from China in this direct from China shipping model. However, I think the competition has evolved quite differently now, and Temu has done some business and operational innovation that has made others, including Shein, to have to catch up.
I think they're two very separate entities and they should be looked at differently. But maybe we start with the people. I think, as you said, Skywolf from Shein is extremely elusive and there's very little thing written about him. I think the nearest one is a biography I read from Financial Times. And Temu as well. We know Colin Huang is the founder of Pinduoduo, but he stepped down recently as well in the last few years when there was a regulatory crackdown. So maybe who are now the key people behind Temu and Shein in each of their respective companies?
So for Shein, definitely, the key executive teams, the original four co-founders are still very much hands-on involved in operation, which is my understanding. But a few years ago, they hired Donald Tao, who is
Yes.
American, Chinese American, and veteran banker. He used to be the Asia chair of Bernsteins. And so he then officially took the role of executive chairman, I think from about a year and a half or 2 years ago, and has basically been the public face of Shein. He has done a lot of media interviews and public speakings to try to demystify Shein and to try to clarify some of the what he thinks sort of unfair allegations leveled against the company. And he has also been aggressively meeting with lawmakers on Capitol Hill, doing the same thing. But by comparison, Temu, so far, similar to Pinduoduo or PDD, still doesn't really have like a visible figure that they put in front of the public. So it's actually, I would say it's probably like an open secret or complaint, like among at least the buy side, sell side, the investing community, that PDD has always been this really mysterious company. Some analysts who cover PDD told me before they couldn't even get like an actual human being from the IR, the investor relations team, to interact with them. It's always done over email. And then there's been numerous reports about how PDD has this tradition of every employee use a pseudonym, right? Colleagues don't even know each other's real names until they both left the company, maybe. And then, so I would say after Colin Huang stepping down, you hear from executives on the quarterly investor calls. That's like pretty much it for as far as the public's access to its leadership goes. So I think Temu basically, when we look at the back end of sort of operation, I would just say there's not like a very strict like separation between the two companies. And actually, there is a very core team from Pinduoduo, which, is like a sort of all-star team that was responsible for launching Pinduoduo's domestic grocery business. Then later a lot of them were like moved to be tested with working on Temu and launch it quickly.
No, so it's some kind of special forces team that has actually been
Maybe,
assigned to do Temu basically.
yeah,
And
like
we
the
don't know who
same.
they are. Yeah,
Yeah, I definitely don't.
I always remember Benedict Evans, one of my guests on the show, always says that, when the US Congress wants to be forceful, they will call someone else from Silicon Valley and yell at them if they make any mistakes. The problem with Shein is they can get Donald Trump to do it, but for Temu is that they don't even know who to yell at in the process as well on that. But let's just talk about their performances for Shein and Temu in the year 2023, which is last year. And just for specifically Shein, how are they compared to their European fast fashion rivals? And this we talk about HMV, Zara. I mean, Japan will be Uniqlo, fast retailing, which is their holding company as such.
First and foremost, I mean, Shein remains private, so their financials they don't disclose their financials. I have reported Shein's full year financials from 2019, I believe. So I have reported the top line and the bottom line throughout, between 2019 and 2023. And the company has been profitable actually since 2019. So in a way, you can say they are probably not in a dire need to go public from a fundraising perspective.
Yeah,
So in 2023, Shein recorded 32.2 billion in annual sales, up 40% compared to 2022. And then the top line growth also accelerated. So their previous year growth was, 2022 versus 21 was 37%. And then so what 32.2 billion means in perspective, really, that is way above, it's already way ahead of the sales generated by Zara and H&M respectively.
Yep.
Well, bear in mind that Zara and H&M have, different way of counting their fiscal years. But for like a not very Apple like for like comparison, Zara had about the equivalent of $28 billion revenue in the 12 months to January this year, while H&M had about $22 billion revenue in the 12 months to November last year.
Wow. That's really good. But I think they also have the benefit of not having physical retail space as such. But what about Temu then? How are they performing in the last year?
Yeah, so there have been various analyst reports that suggest Temu had already been break even or maybe even profitable on like a EBITDA or growth level. The interesting thing here is that PDD till this day still has not broken down any financials for Temu, despite how big and quickly this part of the business has grown. So we don't really know. And there's ways that you can probably do some guesstimates, which
Right.
is I think what a lot of analysts have done. So then in terms of GMV or gross merchandise volume, then Temu had about 17 billion globally last year, and about 10 billion of that was from the US. This is the estimate from Bernstein analyst Robin Zhou. And since you asked me, these look like big numbers on its own, but we also need to. But I like to think like numbers usually don't mean anything unless we contextualize it. So there's been so much coverage and discussions about the challenge that Temu and Shein posed to Amazon. But if we put things in perspective, Amazon's GMV. By the way, Amazon also does not no longer discloses its GMV in its financials anymore. So I'm quoting numbers from Marketplace Pulse. It's an e-commerce consultancy which has done really good work on this space as well. So their estimate is that in 2023, Amazon's total GMV was $700 billion. So
Got it.
basically, if you put Temu and Shein together, they probably just remain a tenth of Amazon's GMV.
Wow. Okay, just before I continue, I better make a full disclosure as well. I'm an actual shareholder of Amazon because I used to work for AWS, and whatever this is not for investment purpose, it's also for information, for entertainment purposes as such. But let me get back to the conversation with Shein. They recently partnered with their rival, which is Forever 21, which is I think somewhere happened in August 2023, and I think you have reported a bit about the story. What's the essence behind their partnership?
Yeah, it's a very interesting development for the fast fashion space as well as for Shein. So they announced the partnership, as you noted, in August 23, and I interviewed the CEO of Authentic Brands, which owns Forever 21, in addition to a number of other labels. And based on that, I did a story that went back to how this partnership took place. So actually what happened is that it's interesting here. So I know some of the new emerging e-commerce brands might go offline after they have some success online. One example that came to my mind is Love Bonito, which
Right.
is from Singapore, which I really like, by the way. I'm
Oh,
a gold
okay. I will
member
let
of
the
Love
founder know
Bonito.
because I know her.
Oh, great. I love to meet her
Yeah, she used to
some
be my AWS customer, by the way,
Oh, yeah. So
when I was
basically you
working for
look
them. Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, we're definitely gonna try. But if you look at Love Bonito, what they've done is that went from online to offline, right? And then they actually
Yeah.
have outlets in Hong Kong now. And then, however, Shein never wanted to go offline. So they are very determined that okay, we just want to be purely virtual. Of course they've done like pop-up stores here and there, in both the United States and Europe, other places. But that's just something that generates the buzz for consumers to go online. So basically what happened was that Jamie Salter, the CEO of Authentic Brands, actually reached out to Shein first. What he told me was that if you can't beat them, you join them, right? Obviously, he observed the success of Shein, and then he approached Shein first with the proposition of why don't we do a licensing agreement that I'll give you the license to sell Forever 21 merchandise on your website. And for Shein, it's like they receive this kind of offers probably, all the time, and they really are not that interested in doing this. And then the conversation went away for a while. Then Jamie Salter went back and said, what about we do a financial transaction, right? Maybe I invest in you or investing in me, or we could do it both. And then they still weren't interested. So then eventually what happened was that Jamie Salter was able to bring in David Simon, who is this real estate mogul in the US. He's the CEO of Simon Property Group, which is like a really big
Yeah.
mall owner in the United States. And then Authentic Brands and Simon Property Group actually have a joint venture called Spark, SPARC.
Uh,
So then basically then that sort of, moved the needle for Shein. And then they fast forward a few months later, they did a deal in which Shein would issue like about 300 to 400 million worth of shares to buy 33% of this joint venture between Simon Property and Authentic Brands. And then in return, this joint venture will also pay the same amount of stocks to Shein, and then they will end up owning less than 1% of Shein based on its last valuation of $66 billion. And then that's the financial part of the partnership. And then the operational part would be then, given that Shein has been trying to improve its image as a better ESG citizen, so having offline presence for their customers to easily return the stuff that they don't want is very important. So they have started in the US outlets first to allow Shein customers to return orders at Forever 21's outlets. And then they also have done some shopping shop pop-ups. For example, I think the first one they did, which made a lot of headline, was I believe it was in November in Manhattan. There's Forever 21 inside of Forever 21's big like a flagship outlet. Inside, I think they dedicated like a floor space to for Shein's merchandise.
Shein is interesting. They are starting to go into the offline world, but I think we will switch now to Temu before we get back to Shein later for some of these things that we're going to be talking about. Let's come to Temu because there's a lot of interesting stories I know you have broke in the last couple of weeks. I want to start off by one thing I do know is, can you explain how Temu actually maintain a very tight control over its suppliers? And what are the specific practices they use to actually manage and monitor their supply chain? Seriously, I didn't know that until you broke the story, how much control they had over their supply chain on that.
What did you feel when you were reading that story, by the way?
I felt that being their supplier is really painful. It's like having some mafia boss have control over the territory of the entire supply. And if I don't work with them, I'm going to be in big trouble. Yeah. Do or do not, I have to work with them if I'm a supplier for them.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I know that there's been a lot of allegations on both companies, right? That they are able to keep prices so low because, they must have something really seriously unethical going on in their supply chain. Well, I'm not saying that is not the case. I wouldn't say that's the main reason why they're able to keep prices so low. Let's talk about labor first. I think it's a common knowledge already that so a lot of Shein's manufacturers are in Guangdong province. And Guangdong is like the richest province in all of China. The average wage is like the highest within China. Then the average wage of Chinese workers is nowadays is much, much higher than say those in Bangladesh or Vietnam, right? So to say that it's because of cheap labor really doesn't make sense in that sense, right?
Yeah.
If we look back at Temu, it is true that whatever this overcapacity issue that has sort of grappling, that the Chinese economy has been grappling, definitely filled a lot of the supply side for Temu. That is definitely true. So basically, the factories that Temu works with are the kind of factories that usually supply in the past to big brands, but then for various reasons, these export orders, the volume of such has come down quite a lot. So when Temu came to these small and medium-sized factories, it really provided a lifeline to these factories, which can explain why even if they knew they signed a deal with the devil, they still had to do it. I mean, double in quotation marks.
Yeah.
I'm not,
yes, agree. Yeah, it's a quotation marks. Okay. Yep.
Yeah. And let's drill down to the controls, they say. I mean, in a nutshell, Temu absolutely runs its suppliers with an iron fist and an impressive level of micromanagement. Basically, if you are a factory owner and you want to sell on Temu, and then you go through the registration process and everything is by the book, what happens is that you need to pitch, say, I want to sell this product, then you need to send samples to Temu's staff, and then they need to approve that sample. After that, then you submit online whatever media, like images, for example, when you want to go to display this product, and then you propose the pricing. All of this has to be approved by Temu's side. After that, so basically Temu dictates what kind of products the sellers can sell and at what prices. So that's the first step. And once you join and you manage to get your listing up on Temu successfully, then it goes with and shipping. So what the Chinese sellers have to pay for, they only have to pay for the shipping from their own warehouses to Temu's warehouses in China. Everything from there, they do not have to pay for anything. Neither do they have to pay for any marketing or advertising fees. So basically, Temu controls like how it decides to distribute the traffic across its platforms and its listing based on whatever intel they gather from their algorithms. So that is basically the sellers are not really like running their shops. They're basically more similar to the wholesaler's role to a retailer in traditional retailing, other than a typical Amazon marketplace model, which I'll explain the difference later. But then let's go back to Temu. And then, so that is not all of it, right? So then basically, after all that is done, and then you started selling, and then, yeah, sure, it's very good a solution, actually, a lot of its factory owners, because they don't actually know how to sell online, let alone selling to other countries, right? This one-stop solution is very appealing at the beginning, but over time, then issues started popping up. For example, if you have an item that sells really well, and Temu's platform catches that, then actually they'll instantly come back to the seller and say, hey, we saw this doing really well. Can you reduce the price? And then you can choose to say no as a seller, right? I really can't go any lower. This is the lowest I can go, or I'm not having any margin. But then if they actually do that, then what Temu will do is they'll basically slowly divert the traffic away from this listing.
Right.
And in the meantime, they will try to solicit similar products from other suppliers who can offer the kind of prices they want. Then for these other suppliers who can go even lower, obviously, as you can imagine, they most likely they manage to produce like a lookalike product, but maybe the raw materials or the production that goes into the product are like maybe inferior or less good quality. This is why you see a lot of complaints these days about, oh, this thing is so cheap, or it broke like just after a while or something. This could be an explanation to why that is the case. Okay, so for example, then in this case, suppliers are oftentimes just cornered, backed into a corner, right? It's like, damn you do and damn you don't.
That's right.
If you say, I cut the price, then I don't have the margin. If I don't cut the price, not only that my products will not be selling in that as much as anymore, I also risk making losses on the inventory that I already shipped and are stored in Temu's warehouses. Because the one thing that makes Temu quite different from the traditional retailer is that they do not purchase the inventory from the seller first. So none of the inventory goes on Temu's balance sheet, but the kind of control that they are able to exert over the sellers is quite similar to the one that a retailer would exert on a wholesaler. So then, in a way, Temu created this business model that allows them to have the best of both worlds.
Yeah, it's very extreme because they actually haven't done the part where they actually create their own version, or I call it the Amazon basics or Temu basics, to actually kill off those suppliers who don't play ball if it happens. But we haven't got to that yet.
Excuse me, and then just a little bit on the control. So a new emerging issue that started from maybe last year is that a lot of the suppliers also have seen that their payments, like the receivables, being docked by the platform without much explanation.
Wow.
So I've seen screenshots of these docked payments. They come up just as a list and then say what time and how much money And that was it. There was no explanation as to why this receivable was docked. Is it because a specific customer complained or an order was returned? There's no any of such explanation. They just have to accept that some of the earnings are just not going to be not going to end up in their pockets. And then this actually has become a growing grievance for some of Temu sellers. One of them who were quoted in the story said that these deductions, these penalties really depressed us.
So maybe that is the interesting part, right? How does Temu's supply management practices compare to, say, the others, say, Shein or even Amazon, for that matter?
Yeah, so with Shein, they operate more like the traditional retailer and wholesaler, right? They do own the inventory on the products they contract to the manufacturers. And then with Amazon, Amazon is the marketplace, the e-commerce platform that most of us are familiar with. And to give you some distinctions. So, for example, with Amazon, as sellers are free to sell anything they want at any prices they want, as long as it's not, for example, forbidden goods like drugs or porn, right? So this is
That's right.
something that every platform has, right? Other than that, then you are free to do whatever you want. Once you are in the marketplace, you can pay Amazon for this pay per click keyword advertising. It works very similar to Google search results. Say I'm selling
Yep.
like a mug, and then I'll just buy the keywords attached to my product. And then the higher I pay, then the higher my product listing will appear in this
Yes.
keyword results on Amazon website. In addition, Amazon has spent a lot of time and money building their Fulfill by Amazon logistics capability, which is something adopted by quite a lot of third-party sellers. But then this, which is also what propels Amazon's fast delivery. And then this service is not free for sellers, so they have to pay to use Fulfill by Amazon. In addition, obviously, Amazon also charges the commission fees, right? So I would say these three things are the main ways that Amazon makes money. But then by comparison, Temu makes money from basically pocketing the price difference between what they sell to what the sellers sell, get provided to them, and what customers pay for.
There's something like arbitraging between both sides. So there is a possibility that these supplies can still go direct to Amazon, except that it's going to be very difficult for them. They provide that one-stop shop for Temu to arbitrage them like a middleman. Did I understand that correctly?
I would just say it's not really like an arbitrage. I mean, the typical seller profile on Amazon is quite different from the typical Temu seller. A typical Amazon seller in China is usually a wholesaler itself who actually source these goods from the factories or maybe other wholesalers. And then the typical seller on Temu is the factory itself.
Yep.
And then this is very important because this makes it sort of quite different. This makes it quite difficult for like the typical Temu seller to join Amazon and vice versa.
I think that's a very good distinction and very good point, because I think a lot of people don't realize that how different an Amazon and a Temu seller are in their respective geographies or backgrounds as such. One question probably would come up immediately after this would be, how did Amazon enable the expansion of Shein and Temu into the US market? I think it's the biggest enabler as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think maybe from two ends. From the consumer end, obviously Amazon educated the US consumers on online shopping. And then, but what's also, which is very evident, right? But I would say that the other part that is very important is that about half of Amazon's third-party sellers is actually from China. So then this means that Amazon also helped educate from Chinese factories to Chinese merchants the concept of selling from China to around the world via the internet.
One interesting thing is that there are a couple of stories that you all break as well from the information about what is actually Amazon's initial reaction when one of his executives, Doug Harrington, actually highlighted that Temu is now not just selling on us, but it's also becoming a significant competitor to us that got them caught flat-footed on their side.
Yeah, so this is from a story that I did with my New York-based colleague, Theo Wade, who covers Amazon. We had this amazing anecdote, really, that basically, you remember Temu had its first Super Bowl ads blitz actually in February 2023.
Yeah.
And then at that time, there was already a lot of buzz about this company. The head of Amazon e-commerce, Doug Harrington, so he forwarded a news article about Temu to his entire team and asked them what they think about this. And then the consensus among Harrington's team is that PDD's wholesale relationship with Chinese vendors made it possible for Temu to offer rock bottom prices to US consumers. And that combined with Temu's direct shipping from China to US model represented a threat. And Amazon needed to do something very quickly.
Yeah. And then how does Temu's entry into the US market now influence Amazon's business strategies? And I think the other more interesting question is what responses that Amazon has actually made to blunt the risk of having Temu and Shein siphoning away their shoppers with cheap goods.
Yeah, so if we look at Temu and Shein together as rivals to Amazon, then first, what Amazon did last year was that they reduced the commissions on some of the low-priced apparel products, which really barely scratched the surface. Now that we look at it in hindsight, but at that time, it definitely was seen as like a move that okay, Amazon is now going on defensive. What happened earlier this month is a story that I broke first and was widely reported as well, is that Amazon is actually testing a Temu clone section on its website. We don't really know how it's going to look like, but very likely it's going to be maybe now, if it goes live, then when you go to the Amazon website, there might be a separate entry point that gets you to this sort of discounted or bargain version that features goods directly shipped from China. And then so they reviewed this to a selected number of Chinese merchants in China in a closed door meeting. So then they said that they will start signing up merchants for this program from the summer and it began accepting inventory in the fall. And then obviously it's like copying a page from Temu's playbook. And then the delivery will also be a lot slower. What they told the merchants is that it's going to take between 9 to 11 days to arrive.
And then we were supposed to do this podcast a couple of weeks ago and we held it for a while. And you had the latest article, which is really much more interesting than what we were about to talk. So I'm willing to wait it out. So you had the latest article. It also prompted Temu to change its strategy from China to a different approach now that Amazon is entering into their business as such. What happened there?
Yeah, so since March, Temu launched this local warehouse program. Why is it called local warehouse instead of local seller? I'll explain in a little bit. But basically, Temu started signing up merchants who already have inventory stored, say, in the US or Europe, wherever it's now available in several markets in Europe, and then US and Canada and New Zealand and Australia. So if you are a seller who already has the inventory, say in the United States, and you want to sell to the United States, then you can join. Same goes for Europe and the other places. It has grown so fast. It's like an incredible speed. And I reported that this part of the business, essentially products that shipped from a local warehouse in the US to the hands of US consumers, already represented 20% of Temu's GMV in the US. And this was 2 weeks ago. I believe the number is probably even higher though. Now, according to Marketplace Pulse, more than a quarter of the new merchants that Temu has been signing in since March on a monthly basis are these local warehouse suppliers. And then typically these sellers are actually not like a sort of bona fide American sellers. There are some of them, but the vast majority of them are still Chinese sellers who are just like of this scale that already have inventory in the US. So the sellers themselves basically manage to ship the goods very likely via maritime freight, ocean freight from China to their own warehouses in the US. And they also need to handle the delivery themselves. It makes Temu, this is what we say like in this business, what is really interesting in the last couple of months is like, or in this month, past months is that you see Amazon is trying to become Temu and Temu is trying to become Amazon. In a gross generate simplification, that's what it looks like. However, though, what Temu is trying to do with the local warehouse program is that there has been no sign to suggest that Temu actually wants to do this kind of capital intensive in-house logistics build-up, like what Amazon has done with Fulfilled by Amazon. Instead, they're just delegating this to capable and sizable sellers. And what they need to do is basically just make sure that the sellers can live up to the delivery quality that they require.
Yeah, there's this quote that I always tell my ex-Amazon colleagues now is that, Amazon is like a Chinese company, it's just that it doesn't know it yet. So what implications does Temu's strategic shift will have for the broader e-commerce landscape, not just within US, but also maybe across the world? Yeah.
So I think first, Temu first emerged as maybe a follower of Shein, but I think right now you probably can argue Temu is now the trendsetter instead. They're a local warehouse, which some sort of industry insiders call the semi-managed model, as compared to the fully managed model, which is the direct from shipping from China model. Actually has inspired Shein and AliExpress. They both also have done the same recently. We have seen that different countries actually around the world have reacted quite differently from this, right? I'm sure you are aware the controversy in the US we'll get into a little bit, but I'm sure you're aware in France, for example, they're trying to do some sort of fast fashion penalty. Similar thing is happening in Brazil, where they already passed the law to mandate that lower level imported parcels, e-commerce parcels have to pay additional tax. I think similar thing is also happening in Thailand. I believe it's being discussed, right?
Yeah.
I think it's definitely going to be interesting, but then obviously we are all consumers at the end of the day, both you and me and your audiences. In a way, additional competition and an innovation in business model is definitely eventually benefits consumers.
I think one question I do have is how reliant is Amazon from the Chinese sellers? And what does it mean for them in the long term then?
Again, I'm going back to my favorite, one of my favorite e-commerce consultancies, Marketplace Pulse. I'm just using their number. So their number suggests that China-based sellers represent about half of the top 10,000 sellers in Amazon in the US. Why top 10,000? Because that is the cohort that drives about half of Amazon's third-party GMV. Okay, so this sounds very convoluted, right? But let's just try to break it down. I said earlier that Amazon's GMV last year is estimated at 700 billion. And of that, about 70% or $480 billion comes from third-party sellers.
That's
so
right.
Of this 70%, then about half of them was driven by the top 10,000, and half of that is from China. So then by simple extrapolation, you get about, I just did the math, about 120 billion of GMV comes from this, comes from China sellers.
And we haven't factored in that there might be sellers from other geographies relying on Chinese manufacturing to send over to the US, right? That number should be slightly bigger, which I was reading the number in my mind. I was like, no, it's higher than that. It's definitely higher than that.
And also Amazon's own products, right? The Amazon basics. I'm sure they also source and manufacture from China too, right? So this $120 billion figure is like really the most modest estimate, I think.
And then now we come to the most interesting part of the conversation, which is the US-China tensions, right? So there have been discussions on a potential US ban on Temu imports due to the concerns over forced labor or maybe the levies and such. What are the driving factors behind this potential ban?
A ban on Temu started to gain traction from US lawmakers from the beginning of this year. And there's a few sort of allegations, reasons cited. The way that Temu has managed to get its goods into China means that it may have not needed to comply with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So let me just unpack this a little bit. That first thing we need to know is this trade provision, which is dubbed as de minimis. Basically, what it means is that any parcels valued under $800 that enter the US do not need to pay import duties.
That's right.
Also, see very little customs inspection. And then this has been one of the reasons that underpinned the rise of Shein and Temu and others, because obviously, I would say vast majority of Temu and Shein's parcels entering the US are way below the $800 figure, right? Because this kind of parcel does not need much custom inspection, that also means that if a parcel contains product or something, a product or labor sourced from Xinjiang Autonomous Region, where the US alleges is rampant and against the forced labor of the Uyghur minorities, then that would mean that it violates the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Because what this act, which was passed in 2021, aims to do is to ban any imports of goods that either are manufactured or sourced from Xinjiang into the US.
So what impact would you have on their operations if that ever happens?
Yeah, look, maybe let's unpack this a little bit as well. First, let's talk about the impact. Then we can talk about the likelihood of it actually happening, right?
Right.
So, I mean, if basically the UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, maintains a so-called blacklist. And if you are included on that blacklist, that means that you cannot import anything into you cannot export anything into the US. And then so there's been advocacy for Temu to be added on that blacklist, which then I would say 5 months ago would definitely decimate Temu's business in the US. However, as we noted that they've been trying to grow this local warehouse program as a way to counter such a scenario, such a threat, then probably if this ban really happens, the blow would be smaller. I mean, it will still be significant, but it wouldn't completely eviscerate their entire business in the US.
Right.
So, and then in terms of likelihood of the ban actually happening, so there's been several legislative and administrative avenues being pursued, right? On the legislative side, the problem with the UFLPA is that it was not drafted with e-commerce companies in mind. It was only drafted with the traditional exporters and manufacturers in mind. So they actually don't really know how to deal with an e-commerce company, right?
Okay.
And then they also are worried about like, okay, if you really put him on the list, what does that mean for Amazon? Who can assure like none of Amazon's products that get sold into the US do not have any trace of element from Xinjiang, right? So that's the conundrum here. And then the other avenue that has been pursued and proposed is to lower the de minimis threshold, right? Right now, $800 seems too high. Maybe we do it to 100 or some other number. But there has not been enough legislative consensus or momentum to actually materialize either avenue. So that instead, what U.S. Lawmakers have done is to pressure the Department of Homeland Security, which in essence is in charge of the implementation of the UFLPA. And then they pressure the Department of Homeland Security as well as U.S. Customs and Borders Protection to start applying more scrutiny on this kind of cheap parcels. And then we already have seen a little bit of results. from this heightened, you can call it a crackdown, which we can talk about later. But right now, it seems like a ban is still somewhat distant, I would say, especially as you noted, the election is getting more and more dramatic every year, every day. And I guess this issue might not be the front and center of people on the Capitol Hill, probably. I don't know.
I guess how will now Temu reduce its reliance on US shoppers? Do they go to the other markets? I mean, actually, this is interesting because Singapore used to have that cap also $400, but now everything is going into the local goods and services tax, which is 9%.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's
Wait,
because I used to be a senior executive in Singapore Post, which we do the logistics for Alibaba across the entire Asia Pacific, being in the executive
oh,
team there. That was my experience. Sorry. That is how I know.
okay. So, by the way, how popular are Temu and Shein, or how visible are they in
I
Singapore?
think Shein is very visible in Southeast Asia. And Temu, yes, but there is local competitors. So you think
Mm,
about TikTok Shop, you think of your
yeah,
Lazada, you think of
Shopee.
Shopee. Yeah, I
Mm,
don't think they're very visible in the Southeast Asia region. I don't think they
yeah,
think it's a very big market to fight on. That's
yeah.
my sense of how Pinduoduo scopes out the Southeast Asia market. I could be totally wrong. They may be already here, but I don't see them doing anything.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like it's that it may be a conscious choice that they made not to go big on Southeast Asia because it's a really competitive and crowded space, as well as less smaller GDP per capita, ergo less spending power per head.
Right.
So what Temu has done since the beginning of this year is against the growing resistance or criticism against this company, then they started to make a very conscious decision to stop, to reduce their dependency on the US market. And what they've been doing instead is to put more resources into growing Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Korea, Japan. And then, for example, they do that through different ways, right? Such as telling their merchants to maybe prioritize their inventory based on items that sell better in those markets than in the US. Then they also maybe spend more marketing dollars in those markets as well.
Mm.
But
So,
it's worth
mm,
noting that in Temu's response to me, they absolutely rejected this notion that they say that they still remain very committed to the US market. It's their first market. They consider it their home market.
yeah,
Just to be
and of course, the all the countries that you mentioned all have a local competitor, so it's going to be a bit of a tough fight if they were to do that. So, how is the U.S. government now escalating the crackdown on this trade rule behind Shein and Temu? And I think the more interesting question is, you already given Temu's response. What would be the responses for maybe Shein towards the government if something of that kind of ban is going to come in play?
Yeah. So what has happened is that I also reported to my colleagues a couple of months ago that there has been what the industry calls custom brokers. What is basically logistics companies that help their customers to go through custom clearance. And we reported that the U.S. Customs actually cracked down on some of these custom brokers. Although we did not establish that any of the companies implicated actually handle shipments or custom clearance for either Temu or Shein, but I think it's a strong enough sign to show that the US government has been cracking down in general on those lower value cheap parcels entering the US. And in terms of company response, so Temu's response, I think we have already been through. Pretty much, I would say it's a very smart solution by just doubling down on the local warehouse program. In terms of Shein's response to this growing pressure, so I reported that in April, Donald Trump sent an email to the senior employees in the US. And then the subject of the email says compliance, foundational to who we are. And in the email, that basically Donald told all the senior employees at Shein in the US that the company now has to really prioritize compliance. How are they going to prioritize compliance? So it is manifesting the following ways. First is that they are going to increase the staffing of their in-house compliance team by 50%. That's like, personnel wise. And then they're also going to increase their spending on, third-party supply chain vetting firms, such as ESG auditing firms, by another 50% by 2026. And they also set up like a dedicated email for any employee to report non-compliance incidences and promise that employees that there will be no retribution for coming forward. So this has been Shein response.
Yeah. So this is the most probably interesting question now. Can Shein eventually IPO and still have access to the US market, given that now they're doing all these compliance work before the IPO?
Yeah, if I have answer to that question, believe me, I wouldn't be sitting here.
Right.
It's literally a multi-billion dollar question, right? I mean, we have seen that since Shein ditched the plan to list in the US, they've been trying with London, and in London we also see this growing criticism and resistance against Shein being listed in London. So I think it's and also Chinese regulators' attitude toward Shein is also ambivalent, to say the least, so far. So it is very difficult to say at this point. And then in terms of Shein's ability to access the US market, unless, unless Shein gets banned, or if there's new legislation in the US that drastically lowers the cap of the duty-free parcels, then I think Shein will still be okay, right? They can still business as usual in the US. But that's not to say that they don't have to do more to prove that they are a good corporate citizen and all of that. But at least in terms of accessibility, I don't think right now whether they can access the US market is tied with whether they can list in the US.
My final closing question would be, what about Temu? Given that if the US will ever limit their access, that means they are only going to be just limited to Pinduoduo, which is already in China, or maybe other parts of the world rather than the US market.
Yeah, I mean, it's predicated really on whether they are going to be banned in the US. If they do, then obviously things will get difficult for them. And also, maybe there will be other jurisdictions, especially those in the West, that would be tempted to follow the US. It's something that we've seen played over and over again in the TikTok situation, right? And then if not, then they're probably going to be okay. I would say that Pinduoduo and Temu together, they are like, business-wise, they are really shrewd and really sophisticated and really smart. They keep coming up with new solutions, new innovations, modifications to their business model. The fact that they came up with this sort of semi-marketplace, semi-retailer e-commerce model is quite amazing. If you just think about it, it would be a very good business school case study for what that matters. Definitely things are getting more and more interesting. When I really started looking into this around March, April, I did not expect things could be so that things could move so fast. We're already season 3 of this e-commerce battle show. I think that's what I feel, right? We already talked about that, right? And by the way, we haven't even talked about TikTok Shop today, right?
Yes.
And when you involve TikTok Shop, then the whole thing is it opens up many other, debate and discussion, but maybe for another time. Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to get back to TikTok at some point. Okay. Jing, many thanks for coming on the show. And this is a very interesting conversation. In closing, 2 quick questions. Any recommendations which have recently inspired you?
Yeah. So first I'd like to recommend for anyone who wants to gain a more comprehensive understanding of how China regulates its tech sector and by extension the private sector, and simply, wanting to sound more smart in conversations about China, that I highly recommend Angela Zhang's new book, High Wire. And she is joining the University of Southern California in the fall to be a professor of law. And previously, she was teaching at the University of Hong Kong. I've known and spoken to Angela for a number of years, a number of times. This is, and then she spent the past couple of years working on this book. It basically covers the 2020 to 2022 tech platform crackdown in China. And she had a very elegant way of sort of deciphering the regulatory framework and what caused the crackdown and how it was actually implemented and what it means for future tech regulation framework in China.
Got it.
And
I'll
I
probably
also,
read that book definitely. I'll definitely read
yeah,
it.
it's a very good read. And then to in the spirit of making it a tradition, I also give a couple non-business, non-tech related recommendations. Which I'll restart the sentence.
Um,
The last book I read is this book called Dopamine Nation: Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. It was published in 2021 by a renowned psychiatrist and academic. If you want to understand how our brain responds, did you get that? Sorry,
yeah, I got that. I got it. Yeah.
other sentence. If you want to understand how our brains respond to pleasure and pain, positive and negative stimuli, I highly recommend this book. It's just a fascinating read, and it's not dry at all. It has like many like amazing case studies from her patients, which she was authorized to disclose. And then so the third but not last recommendation I have is The Three Body Problem, the book. So I mean, I love the Netflix show. I actually watched it twice. That's how much I liked
Okay.
it. But I feel like, and I'm very glad that the show made the book, the franchise better known to, the audience beyond the sci-fi. But if you feel you are gripped by the show, then I highly recommend you actually read the book. I got so excited. I mean, I read the trilogy like many years ago, but after I watched the Netflix show, I got so excited about it. I went back to read some chapters of the
Mm.
book.
Can I
Um,
ask a question? Have you read the
sure.
Chinese version of the books?
Yeah, I read the Chinese version,
Ah, then that's
but
interesting.
yeah, but I know that the English version, the beginning of the English version is different. It actually
Yep,
started with that scene from the Cultural Revolution.
that's right.
And I read an interview with the author Liu Cixin. He actually said that he initially wanted to begin the book with that Cultural Revolution thing, but he knew if had he done that, the book probably will never get published in China.
Yeah, which is something that is very useful for people who are watching this podcast and found out about the three body problem. The actual Cultural Revolution scene doesn't appear in the Chinese version, which actually I have to read it to find out myself. I actually read both versions because yeah, it's important to see the original version. Where can my audience find you then?
I am on Twitter at Jing Yang HK. My DM is open. You're welcome to message me
Mm,
anytime with anything,
really?
feedback or even criticism. Um, and then I'm also on LinkedIn. And last but not least, if you think my conversation on Temu and Shein has been useful, I also encourage you to subscribe to the information because that's where we publish all the exclusive insights and not just on e-commerce, but on AI and many other tech-related subjects. And my email is just very simple, jing@theinformation.com.
Yep, and we're definitely putting all the links to all the articles that you have broken on Temu and Shein over the past year or so. So you can definitely find this podcast everywhere from YouTube to Spotify. And of course, email me and give me any feedback as possible. So Jing, many thanks for coming on the show and we'll continue to talk.
Thank you for having me.